In recent weeks, I've been hearing that song a lot on Christian radio, and as I listen to it, the title of it is called Slow Fade. And as I listen to it, it just challenges me. It causes me to think about how things happen in life. You know, crises don't come in life most of the time. Just all of a sudden a crisis happens and our life is thrown into a shambles. But often a crisis comes from a series of steps, a slow fade that, little decisions that we make along that takes us to a point that brings us to a tipping point or a crisis point. When I was growing up, I remember a children's game called Don't Spill the Beans. And in that game, there was this plastic container, this bean pot that sat in the middle of the table, and it was kind of on a pivot that would tilt, and you'd go around the people playing the game, and you'd put in one bean at a time, and when you started out, it was real easy. You could put a bean on, and nothing would happen. But the more beans that got there, the more tottery the bean pot got, and there came a point at which when one person put one more bean on, it caused the whole pot to spill. It was that tipping point, but it wasn't the one bean that really caused it to tip. But there was a series of things, a series of beans that were put in place, and that one final bean wasn't the cause of everything. But that one final act, that one placement of one final bean caused the pot to reach the tipping point and spill. In life, we reach a tipping point because of a series of decisions. A series maybe of smaller decisions that may be taking us down a road, may take us down a slow fade. A slow fade when you give yourself away. I'm reminded of James talking about what happens with how temptation starts with a thought in our mind, and then it leads to the act of sinning. It's an issue of a thought comes in our mind, and we entertain it, we fantasize about it. We maybe figure out how can we put ourselves in a place to experience this activity, experience this sin. How can we do it that we maybe don't get caught? And the more we think about it, the more we plot it. Eventually, when that opportunity comes, then we act upon the sin. It's a slow fade when you give yourself away. It's something that's been building up for some time. It's a slow fade when black and white, right and wrong, seem to turn to various shades of gray. Thoughts invade, choices made. It's a slow fade. As you begin a new year, how would you describe your walk with the Lord? Would you describe your walk with the Lord as just kind of a slow fade? Oh, you want to be close to God. You want to have an alive and vital faith, but, well, life's so busy. There's so many things happening, and so your Christian walk has kind of become a slow fade. There's no time for prayer. There's no time for reading the Bible, and you come to church when you can, but it's just not something you're able to do as often as you once did. I don't believe any of us have an intention of drifting away from God. But when we're not intentional about investing in our spiritual walk, intentional about investing in our spiritual growth, then the result is a slow fade. As we look at this morning's scripture reading found in the book of Daniel, in Daniel we're introduced to, in the beginning of the book, a young man, probably was in his early teens, was God-fearing, was a Jew, wanted to be a faithful Jew. He grew up in Jerusalem, and Daniel finds himself taken into captivity. King Nebuchadnezzar has attacked Jerusalem, and he's taking some of the brightest and the best back to Babylon as captives. And Daniel is one of those captives, along with three of his friends that you may have heard of in another story in the book of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And as they're taken back, these are probably young teenage boys. As we read about them in verse 3, it says that the king ordered one of his officials to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. Now, being in captivity would certainly be no one's choice. But if you're going to be in captivity, I think being in captivity in the king's palace would be a preferable place than to be as a slave who's doing hard labor. Daniel was in a bad spot in that he was in captivity, but he was in a good spot in that his captivity meant that he was in a place where he was learning, where he was being taught, where he was being nurtured, where he was eating from the king's table. He was eating food from the king's table and drinking wine from the king's table. So, when someone finds himself in a difficult situation like Daniel finds himself, I don't believe any of us would fault them for doing what it takes to survive. Whatever the king requires of you, that's what you do, and you don't second guess it. But Daniel found himself in a compromised place. Even though he was eating from the king's table, he found himself in a compromised place because he had food that was put before him that was not kosher. He had food put before him that as a good Jew he would never eat. It said that Daniel didn't want to defile himself. The way that he was defiled by the food on the king's table, one is, you may recall in Jewish law, there is some food that's considered clean and some food that's considered unclean. Well, on the king's table, there were foods that the Jews would have considered unclean, but yet it was placed before Daniel to eat. Another part of Jewish law was any meat that they ate was to be prepared in a certain way. As the animals were killed, they were to be bled, they were not to be strangled, and there were certain ways that it was to be prepared. The other thing is that often the meat that was on the king's table was meat that had been sacrificed to pagan gods. And Daniel didn't want to defile himself by eating any meat that had already been offered to pagan gods. So Daniel finds himself in a tough spot. He finds himself in captivity for one, but also as he's in captivity, to eat from the king's table means that he has to defile himself. He eats some things that he would not otherwise eat as a good Jewish boy. So what's he going to do about it? If he complains, maybe he would be sent out as a slave. Maybe he would be sent to a place that was not as favorable of a spot to be in captivity. But the passage tells us that Daniel found favor in the eyes of his captors. He found favor in the eyes of the one who was training them up. And he heard Daniel's concern. And he said to Daniel, but if I don't make you eat this meat, if I don't make you eat everything that is put out on the king's table, then you're not going to be as healthy as the other captives. And then I'm going to get in trouble because I've not been taking care of you. And Daniel said, okay, tell you what, let's do it for just 10 days. For 10 days, don't make me eat the meat from the king's table. Daniel and also Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, don't make us eat meat from the king's table, but feed us only vegetables and water. And at the end of 10 days, see if we're as healthy as the other captives. And so his captor agreed that he would do that for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it would seem impossible that Daniel was not eating the same meals as everyone else. But yet he was just as healthy. It even says that he was healthier than all the rest. It seemed like something that would be impossible, but with God, nothing is impossible. God can make a way when there seems to be no way.